Something shifted. The constant texts stopped. The emotional pleas disappeared. The attempts to understand their behavior ceased entirely. You didn't announce your departure or stage a dramatic exit. You simply withdrew your energy and redirected it elsewhere. The avoidant noticed immediately, though they'll never admit how quickly they registered the change. Their entire relational strategy depends on a specific dynamic where they control the distance, and you react to that control. But you're no longer playing. You're not even at the table anymore. And this disruption to their psychological game doesn't register as relief or validation of their need for space. It registers as threat. Because an avoidant who isn't being pursued has lost the very mechanism that allows them to feel wanted while maintaining distance. Your indifference dismantles their entire system, and the collapse terrifies them in ways they cannot articulate, the pursuit-dependency reality. The avoidance identity is constructed around not needing people, around being self-sufficient and independent. They pride themselves on not being clingy or desperate like others. But this identity only exists in contrast to someone else's pursuit. The avoidant needs someone to need them, so they can demonstrate their lack of need. They require a partner's emotional investment to prove their own emotional independence. When you pursued, when you cared visibly, when you reached out despite their withdrawal, you provided the perfect backdrop against which they could perform their self-sufficiency. Your caring was the canvas on which they painted their indifference. Without your pursuit, their independence has no meaning. It's just loneliness pretending to be choice. The avoidant doesn't consciously recognize this dependency. They experience your pursuit as pressure and your caring as obligation. They tell themselves they want you to stop chasing, to give them space, to respect their boundaries. But when you actually do stop, when your caring evaporates and you become genuinely indifferent, something unexpected happens. The validation they received from being wanted disappears. They can no longer tell themselves they're choosing independence over your need for connection, because you're no longer offering connection to reject. The dynamic that allowed them to feel desired while maintaining control has dissolved. They're left with just the distance, and distance without someone on the other side is abandonment, not independence. This realization creates profound disorientation. The avoidant built their sense of worth on being the one who doesn't need, the one who can take or leave relationships, the one with power through detachment. But that power only existed because you were invested enough to be hurt by their detachment. Your caring gave their distance meaning and impact. Without your emotional investment, their withdrawal is just absence. It doesn't create the dynamic tension they're accustomed to. It doesn't prove their independence or their desirability. It's just empty space where a relationship used to be. An empty space forces the avoidant to confront what they've been avoiding. They are alone not by powerful choice, but by incapacity for connection. The control loss panic. The avoidant's entire relational framework is built on controlling distance. They decide when to engage and when to withdraw. They determine the level of intimacy and the pace of connection. This control protects them from the vulnerability of being left or rejected. If they're always the one creating distance, they can never be abandoned. If they're always withholding, they can never be the one who cares more. But when you stop caring, you've seized control in a way they didn't anticipate. You're not fighting their withdrawal or trying to close the distance they create. You're creating your own distance that has nothing to do with their behavior. You've stepped outside the dynamic they understood and established rules they didn't design. This loss of control triggers the avoidant's deepest anxiety. They cannot manage what they cannot predict, and your genuine indifference is unpredictable in ways their own withdrawal never was. When they pulled away, they knew you would pursue. When they created distance, they knew you would try to close it. These were reliable patterns they could count on. Your reactions were consistent enough that they could calibrate their behavior to maintain the exact level of connection that felt safe. But now, you're not reacting at all. You're not playing by the rules that made the game manageable. The avoidant has no framework for understanding a partner who simply opts out rather than fighting for connection. The panic manifests as attempts to re-establish the familiar dynamic. The avoidant might suddenly reach out after weeks of silence, testing whether your indifference is real or performed. They might create situations that would have previously triggered your pursuit response, watching to see if you still care enough to react. They might offer small gestures of connection, breadcrumbs designed to reignite your investment without requiring real vulnerability from them. These attempts aren't about wanting relationship. They're about restoring the dynamic where they control the distance and you react predictably to that control. Your continued indifference to these manipulations deepens their panic because it confirms that the game has actually ended. The idealization mechanism activation. When you cared, when you pursued, when you were emotionally invested, the avoidant could see every flaw and limitation. Your need for connection felt like pressure. Your emotional availability felt like obligation. Your consistent presence felt like entrapment. The avoidant maintained psychological distance by focusing on everything wrong with you and the relationship. This devaluation protected them from feeling the pull of attachment. But when you stop caring, when you withdraw your energy and attention, something shifts in their perception. Suddenly, the relationship they were running from begins to look different. Your flaws become quirks. Your need for connection becomes evidence of your capacity for love. Your presence becomes something valuable that they took for granted. This idealization isn't about you changing. You're actually the same person you've always been, possibly more authentic now that you've stopped performing for their approval. The change is in the avoidant's perception, which shifts dramatically when the threat of intimacy disappears. As long as you were pursuing, you represented engulfment and loss of autonomy. But now that you've stopped, you represent loss itself. And loss activates the avoidance attachment system in ways that presence never could. They begin remembering the good moments, the connection they felt, the ways you understood them. They conveniently forget the reasons they withdrew. The relationship becomes idealized precisely because it's no longer available. This idealization creates cognitive dissonance that the avoidant struggles to resolve. They spent months or years convincing themselves that the relationship was suffocating, that you wanted too much, that they needed freedom. Now they're confronted with the reality that they had freedom, and it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like emptiness. The narrative they constructed to justify their withdrawal crumbles when faced with your genuine indifference. They cannot maintain the story that they were escaping something oppressive when you're clearly fine without them. The idealization grows as a defense against this uncomfortable truth. If they can convince themselves the relationship was actually valuable, they can avoid confronting the fact that they destroyed something good because of their own limitations. The rejection experience reversal. The avoidant has structured their entire life to avoid rejection. By never fully committing, by always maintaining escape routes, by keeping emotional investment minimal, they protected themselves from the pain of being left or deemed inadequate. They were always the one with less to lose, the one who could walk away, the one who didn't need the relationship as much. This positioning felt safe because rejection couldn't reach them if they never fully offered themselves. But your indifference has reversed the dynamic completely. You're not rejecting them in the traditional sense of evaluating them and finding them wanting. You're rejecting the entire game. You're communicating that whatever they were offering wasn't worth the cost of participation. This rejection cuts deeper than any explicit judgment could because it's not about their specific flaws or failures. It's about their fundamental approach to relationship being unacceptable. The avoidant could defend against criticism of specific behaviors. They could rationalize or justify their need for space. But they have no defense against someone who simply stops engaging with the entire dynamic. Your indifference communicates that their way of being in relationship is so unsatisfying that complete absence is preferable. This is the rejection they've spent their life trying to avoid, and it arrived despite all their defenses. They protected themselves from vulnerability only to discover that their protection itself made them undesirable. The avoidant experiences this as a profound narcissistic wound. Their self-concept depends on being the desired one, the one with options, the one who others chase. They might act indifferent, but underneath they need to know they're wanted. Your caring, even when it felt like pressure, confirmed their desirability. Your pursuit proved they had value, but your indifference suggests they don't have the worth they believed they possessed. Someone evaluated the cost-benefit of relationship with them and decided it wasn't worth it. The avoidant can no longer hide behind the narrative that they're choosing to be alone. They've been chosen against. And this reality demolishes the carefully constructed self-image that protected them from feeling inadequate. The attachment system activation. The avoidant attachment system is designed to deactivate under conditions of closeness and activate under conditions of loss. When you cared, when you were present and available, their attachment system stayed dormant. Your consistency and emotional availability triggered their defenses, keeping them in a state of detachment and withdrawal. But your indifference, your genuine lack of caring, activates the attachment system in ways that intimacy never could. Suddenly, they feel the pull of connection, the anxiety of potential loss, the desire for closeness that they've spent years suppressing. The irony is devastating. They can only feel attachment when the object of attachment is unavailable. This activation doesn't feel like love or desire in any healthy sense. It feels like panic and obsession. The avoidant might find themselves thinking about you constantly, checking your social media, analyzing your behavior for signs that you still care. They might feel compelled to reach out, to test the waters, to see if the door remains open. These impulses confuse them because they contradict everything they believed about themselves and what they wanted. They told themselves they needed space, but now that they have unlimited space, they feel untethered and desperate. They convinced themselves they didn't need the relationship, but now they cannot stop thinking about what they've lost. The attachment system activation reveals the truth the avoidant has been hiding from. They need connection as much as anyone else. Their detachment was never preference. It was protection. And protection is only necessary when something matters. Your indifference has stripped away the protective layer, exposing the vulnerable attachment needs beneath. The avoidant feels these needs and hates feeling them. They experience their own desire for connection as weakness and their inability to remain indifferent as failure. This creates a shame spiral where they simultaneously want to reconnect and despise themselves for wanting it. The internal conflict becomes unbearable, yet they cannot return to the comfortable detachment they once maintained because you've changed the entire dynamic. The narrative collapse crisis. The avoidance life narrative centers on being the person who doesn't need relationship drama, who values independence, who isn't controlled by emotional needs. This narrative makes sense of their patterns and protects their self-esteem. Every time they withdrew, every time they created distance, every time they prioritized autonomy over connection, these choices reinforce the story of who they are. But your indifference challenges the entire narrative structure. If you've genuinely stopped caring, then their independence wasn't a powerful choice. It was just abandonment that eventually drove you away. If you're fine without them, then their self-sufficiency wasn't admirable strength. It was incapacity for intimacy that made them undesirable. This narrative collapse creates an identity crisis. The avoidant has to confront the possibility that their entire self-concept is a defensive construction rather than authentic identity. Maybe they're not actually comfortable alone. Maybe their need for space isn't healthy boundary setting, but fear of vulnerability. Maybe their ability to detach isn't emotional strength, but emotional damage. These possibilities threaten the psychological foundation on which they've built their life. Accepting them would require acknowledging that years of choices were driven by wounds rather than preferences, by fear rather than wisdom. The avoidant would have to grieve not just the loss of this relationship, but the loss of who they believe themselves to be. The narrative collapse also eliminates their go-to explanations for relationship failure. They can no longer blame partners for being too needy, or relationships for being too demanding. You weren't too needy. You were invested in proportion to the relationship. And when that investment became unsustainable, you withdrew it. This is healthy self-preservation, the exact thing the avoidant claims to value. But when someone else exercises the same self-protection the avoidant has always claimed as their right, it reveals the double standard. The avoidant wants the freedom to withdraw without consequence, while also maintaining others' investment and availability. Your indifference exposes this hypocrisy and forces them to recognize that their behavior has natural consequences they can't control away. The mirroring effect terror. Your indifference holds up a mirror showing the avoidant exactly what they've been doing all along. Every time they pulled away, created distance, or responded with coldness, they were communicating indifference to you. But they never had to see what that indifference looked like from the outside because you kept caring, kept trying, kept investing. Your emotions provided evidence that their behavior mattered, that they had impact. Now you're showing them what emotional withdrawal actually looks like. You're reflecting back the detachment they've always offered, and seeing their own pattern from the receiving end is horrifying. The avoidant recognizes in your indifference the same emptiness they've been projecting for years. They see how it feels to reach out and receive nothing back. They experience the confusion of trying to read someone who gives no emotional information. They feel the panic of not knowing where they stand or whether they matter. These are the exact experiences they've been creating for their partners, but they never had to witness or feel them directly. Your indifference is a mirror forcing them to confront the emotional reality they've been inflicting. And most avoidants cannot tolerate this confrontation because it requires acknowledging that they've been the source of the pain they've always feared experiencing. This mirroring also reveals the emptiness at the core of their relational strategy. The avoidant has operated as if detachment equals power and indifference equals strength. But watching you embody genuine indifference shows them what that actually looks like. Not powerful or strong, just absent. Just disconnected, just alone. They see that the independence they've pursued so aggressively is actually just isolation dressed up in philosophical language. The game they've been playing, where they control connection through withdrawal, only works if someone cares enough to be controlled. Your indifference reveals that the game was never sophisticated strategy. It was just fear preventing real relationship, the future alone recognition. When you stop caring, the avoidant is forced to confront their trajectory. If they continue their patterns, this is what relationships will look like. People will invest until the cost becomes too high, and then they'll leave. Not dramatically, not with big confrontations, but with quiet withdrawal of care. The avoidant will be left with their precious independence and complete loneliness. They see in your indifference the future they're creating for themselves, a series of relationships that end not because of conflict, but because of emptiness, because their partners finally recognize that connection requires mutual investment and the avoidant cannot or will not provide it. This recognition triggers existential dread. The avoidant has always told themselves that they could engage in relationship if they wanted to, that their detachment is voluntary and reversible. But your indifference suggests otherwise. It suggests that by the time they decide they want connection, the opportunity will have passed. People will have moved on. The door will have closed. The avoidant faces the terrifying possibility that their protective patterns are actually destructive patterns, and by the time they develop capacity for intimacy, there will be no one left who cares enough to try. They've been so focused on protecting themselves from rejection that they never considered they might protect themselves right into permanent isolation. The future alone recognition also forces the avoidant to question whether they actually want what they thought they wanted. They pursued independence, and now they have it completely. You're not imposing on their space or making demands on their time. They're free in exactly the way they claim to desire. But this freedom doesn't feel like victory. It feels like punishment. The avoidant discovers that what they actually wanted wasn't to be alone, but to be wanted while maintaining the option to be alone. They wanted connection available on their terms. someone who would wait indefinitely for them to feel safe enough to engage. Your indifference reveals that this fantasy was never realistic, that relationships require consistent investment, and that no one will wait forever for someone who cannot show up.